I'm delighted to have you with us today on the Healthcare Leadership Excellence podcast. We have super guests on this podcast. We have discussions before to make sure that they're ready to teach you. And you've got a teacher on the line today. I am so excited. Um, the resume on this person is rather long, so I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details. Just let's say that an MIT undergrad, a Brown PhD, and a UCSD San Diego med degree, plus an excellent book that is coming out soon. I've been able to review a preprint copy of it. Dr. Barry Davis, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Carl. I'm pleased to be here.
So, first, before I jump into our topics today, just give us a brief background on an incredible career. And then you can lead up to your book, and then we're going to jump into that. So tell us a little bit about Dr. Davis.
Sure. Well, I finished my undergrad at MIT, and I went to med school, and I was planning on doing a number of things in med school, but then I decided that I wanted to do more research in a particular area. So I went to Brown and got a PhD in applied mathematics. And after that, I decided the best place for me to go was into clinical trials. So I became a clinical trialist and a prevention scientist, and my specialty was public health and preventive medicine. And I spent the last few decades doing major clinical trials in hypertension, among other kinds of clinical trials. And then at the end, I decided that I looked back and said, what have I learned from all this? And then COVID happened. And I realized that there's a whole story about prevention that needs to be told. So I did a lot of research, and the book is the result of that research.
And I appreciate that introduction to the book. To our listeners, you might think, oh, wow, great, a whole book on preventive medicine. Well, what Dr.
It's not
Davis
on
is,
preventive medicine.
okay, exactly. That's what we want to blow up. He has taken a subject that could have been dead boring and woven it through incredible chapters of history, well researched, incredibly well documented, and in my view, superbly written on 5 or 6 major areas, major accomplishments by people that you probably know something about, and a couple that you probably don't know anything about. So before we jump in there, I want to just go over some items that don't apply directly to the chapters and the history. We have, as I told you in the pre-call, we have people from all levels here. Can you talk to our listeners a bit about how do you go about preventing harm? As a nurse, as a doctor, anything there, how do you go about that? What can they start practicing just today that can get them in the right place?
Well, the first thing you got to do is recognize it. Sometimes harm appears and people just don't recognize it. It could be all around you. And it doesn't have to be specifically, I wrote about diseases and disasters, but it could be something even more mundane than that. But you see signals over and over again that something is not quite right, something's off. You know, and one analogy might be sort of like a leaky roof. You know, just that your roof is all of a sudden something's happening, something's got to cause it. And then the next thing you need to do is you need to move from recognizing it to trying to see, some evidence behind it. What's the cause of this? And you have to gather evidence, and then you have to somehow translate that evidence into doing something about it. In case of a roof, you'd hire somebody, but if it's a workflow problem or something, you have to figure out, how do I fix it? What would be the way to do this so this harm does not occur? And then lastly, on a much bigger scale, sometimes you have to see what's kind of things can I institute so that this doesn't happen again? Can I do something preventable in the future, some institutionalization of this? So, and actually, in the book, in all the chapters, you see that most of the individuals go through this process in one way or another. They don't necessarily think about it as I didn't quite think about it that way when I started writing the book. But after the end, looking back, I saw the pattern that was persistent throughout all the chapters in terms of from recognition of harm to trying to do something about it to even at the end trying to institutionalize a way so that it wouldn't happen.
Excellent. So I probably should have set you up for this question because it's a deep one. Two of my favorite areas of study are critical thinking and complex problem solving because it fascinates me how people think. And yet, with a lot of the clients that I coach, when I ask them how they think, they look at me as if I've asked the most bizarre question they've ever heard. And I had this the other day with the elite cardiologist. It's just brilliant, high subspecialty. And I asked him, because he's having some struggles with staff, and I asked him, do they know how you think? Do they know how you get to a diagnosis? And he looked at me through Zoom, kind of, could you ask the question another way? Because I'm not quite getting it. So, could you describe how you go about looking what needs to be prevented and how you go about solving it, blending critical thinking and problem solving?
Sure. Again, first you have to recognize what the problem is, and you have to then think more about can I gather some evidence to see what might be causing it.
Hmm.
So, my background is not only medicine, but it's also the mathematics. So it's a little more analytical than others. But uh, what's causing this to happen? And once you do that, you have to figure out, well, is there a way to stop it? Is there a way for me to intervene?
Hmm.
And there could be many ways. And you need to sometimes, this isn't all a one person show. You have to deal with others. You have to ask questions, communicate, um, do a back and forth with people and find out what's going on and maybe enlist others to help you. Um, but then once you find out if there is a way to intervene to stop it, how do you implement it? How do you translate that? And then when you figure out how to do that, if there's a way, then you have to figure a way, how do I implement this whole translation? How can I make this a more permanent way of doing things? Hopefully it works out.
Hmm. So, what would you say to, well, one of my questions that comes to my mind, I've heard so many times this blew up on us and we didn't even see it. We didn't even see it. And in retrospect, it's a 8 foot high neon sign blinking at them. Yet in forward thinking, they looked right at it and didn't even see it. So, as a preventionist, as is the Preventioneers is your book, um, as one who's specialized for decades in seeing potential harm, what are some red flags that you see commonly that you see many people looking right by? And why do they look right by them?
Well, there are a lot of possibilities. One thing that's, I said, involved in clinical trials and a lot of scientific endeavors, you have to plan ahead. If when I first started out in clinical trials, you had a protocol, which was pretty common, but protocols are becoming more specific and more detailed to try and plan ahead. But then as time goes on, other things develop. We develop these things called action plans. What if this happens? What if that could go wrong? What if this don't? So, like one thing I can think off the top of my head is for major clinical trials, you had to work on recruitment. you had to recruit investigators and you had to recruit patients. So what's your plan for doing that? And then what could go wrong with that plan? And how do you know something's wrong? So, for example, we created a plan to recruit institutions. We created a plan to recruit patients. And then once you get that, you want to have the patients come in. Um, well, how do you retain your patients? And what happens? How do you know that you're having a problem with keeping them in the trial? What are the red flags? Well, the red flags are they don't respond to your calls. They don't come in for the visits. When they come in, they complain a lot. And sometimes the complaints are very legitimate. Um, so we made a whole list of these things. And it's like just trying to brainstorm and figure out what are the possibilities for these things and then come with an action plan. So, I mean, nowadays in clinical trials, we have like action plans for almost everything, whether it's for the protocol, the statistics, the data monitoring, the recruitment, the retention, the information technology, the databases, and so on and so on and so on. And it gets quite detailed, but you want to be able to have sessions with people who are knowledgeable. What could go wrong?
Excellent. One thing we talked about in the pre-call that I noted here because I wanted to dig down a bit. Medicine, as in other industries, because we don't have just healthcare professionals listening to us, um, we in medicine we go a lot with best practice. And best practice some many times is used appropriately. Sometimes best practice is a way to avoid having to change because that's best practice. I don't know how many times I've heard that. And it may be best practice, but it's not producing the results you want. But so, with that as our scenario, doctor, um, how does new information, how can we get new patterns and new insights through the organizational bureaucracy effectively so we can prevent harm in a new way? An excellent, just short case in point, years back dealing with a surgeon. And he was on a Zoom call with me, and I could tell from his nonverbal he was not having a good day. And he said, I'm just, Carl, I'm up to my ears in bureaucracy. I said, well, what's going on? He said, I cannot get person A to change the protocol. And I said, well, what's the problem? So he explained some things. And then he said, Carl, the biggest frustration is I'm the one that wrote the protocol 3 years ago. But from my studies, I know that it's not best practice anymore. But she won't listen. She will not change the protocol. So, having wandered the halls of bureaucracy for decades, what can you suggest to our listeners that they could do to get the new best practice replacing the old best practice?
Well, there's a lot of things you can do. One of the things is that you have to personally understand what the difficulties are, but then you have to try and get all these people on your side. You have to be able to communicate. You have to be able to understand what they're thinking. Why do they think this isn't changed when maybe the science has changed, or the procedures have changed, or the patient population has changed? And you have to prevent show evidence. Well, look, if we keep going this way, look what's happening. And if you keep going that way, something else is going to happen. We need to come with a new plan to get this together. And we have to try it. We may have to try it out. You may have to do a pilot phase or a short um, introduction of this stuff. But eventually, you have to be able to move people to do things. I mean, the best way is if you can move people enough so that they become the champions of this rather than you. But you keep working at it and just evidence, trust, communication, and then maybe you can move towards this with this translation and implementation that I talked about.
Okay, some further pursuit of some key words you just said. Um, how do you help someone see that it's in their benefit to follow this new plan or practice when they are really deeply entrenched in their habit? How do you get them? You mentioned trust and communication, and that's where I love the decades of experience that you have in academia, in medicine. How do you establish the relationship and communication and the trust? Any suggestions here? Any experience?
Um, well, you have to be able to let the person vent, express themselves. You have to sort of sit in their shoes and understand why they are so invested in, let's say, the old way of doing things, and why, when you show them this new evidence, which is a better way, which will be more productive, and why wouldn't they change? And you may not get an answer from that, but you have to keep trying, and you have to enlist maybe others to convince this person. Um, but it may be a slow process, but you have to try.
Well said. So, to our listeners, as I mentioned in our introduction today, the way that Dr. Davis here has put together this book, maybe it's just me, but I love stories. And so, what could have been very clinically dry data, he's woven into several stories. And we're going to split this episode into two parts because there's no way we can cover all these stories to the depth I want to cover them in only 40 minutes. So, at about 40, we're going to break and go to episode two. But one of your first stories on preventioneers coming on 300 years ago. Yeah, 250 years ago. Benjamin Franklin. Now, we think of him as, an incredible statesman. Most people have him, flying a kite in a rainstorm and with a key on it to attract the lightning strike. But you take a part that many people, including myself, I wasn't that familiar with him and fire prevention. Here is one of the best statesmen of the colonial era who probably saved our neck over in Europe at least a couple of times from the biography I read on him. But tell me about this preventioneer Franklin and the fire department.
Well, this all started with, well, as I said, I was very interested in prevention, and then we had the COVID pandemic and so on. The phrase kept ringing in my head: an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And people cite that all the time. All my years in medicine and public health, people would cite that. So I said, well, why did Franklin say that? And when did he say it? And where did he say it? So didn't take long to find that out. But he said it in a paper that he published, where he surreptitiously wrote himself a letter. He did this a lot in his career. He pretended to be somebody else, wrote the paper, a letter, and then published the letter. Uh, but in the letter, he talks about the title of the letter is on the protection of town from fires. And in the letter, he complains about the fires that are happening all around. And I think the trigger for this was there was a huge fire in Philadelphia in 1730. And he spoke about it thereafter, but he didn't get around to doing this letter until a few years later. But nevertheless, he wrote this letter, and I don't remember the second, third paragraph. He says, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And he starts talking about what you can do to prevent fires. And he goes on to list many, many things in there. And I said, wow, where did that come from? And then I started researching some more, and I realized that from his autobiography and other famous biographies of him, that he had a most interesting life from his childhood. It turns out that he spent some time in London, between moving out of Boston on his way to Philadelphia. And London had this huge fire. It's called the Great Fire of London in 1666. Just destroyed a great deal of London, and they rebuilt London. And while he was there, he learned a lot about what they did and what they did to sort of prevent fires. But even researching it further, I found out that when he was only 5 years old, he witnessed a huge fire in Boston that destroyed the inner part of the city. And I think that probably had an effect on him for the rest of his life. He was thinking about fire in the back of his mind, among many other things that he put. A series of paying attention. He was an incredible observer. He was in what they call an autodidact, somebody who teaches himself. He only had 2 years of school, but he read voraciously. And he learned about all these things, and he learned about what had been done about trying to prevent fires. When he lived in Boston, there were many fires. When he lived in these other places, there were fires. And he kept on thinking about ways that you could do something about it. And he came up with all these ways. He wrote the letter, and then he formed a fire company, and he formed an insurance company. He did many, many things to help prevent fires.
So give us some examples of some creative thinking he used that made this so successful for him. How did he go about looking at things?
Well, it was a combination of looking at things and observing what others had done. Because, as I said, when he was growing up in Boston, he was exposed to these fires. He was exposed to the publishing business because his older brother James had run the New England Courant, and he worked for him for a while. And he would learn about all these things about fires, and he realized that there had been measures in Boston at the time to try and prevent them, but they didn't quite work out. People realized that you shouldn't be building houses just of wood. There should be some brick in it, and the roofs were very subject to fire, and they should really be tiled. And he learned about how people went about their daily business in terms of heating their houses or working with fireplaces. Liquor shops dealt with fires. So he learned about this stuff and he collected it and then he wrote about it. But when he was in London, he learned a lot just by walking around. He walked around the areas that had been burnt down and then built up, and he realized things. And he learned in London about insurance. They had started insurance way before we did, and he thought that was useful. And then while he was in Boston, they had started to form these volunteer fire companies, but they didn't take on as quickly as he would have liked. But when he finally got to Philadelphia, he realized that's what you should do. And eventually he formed one. He became a fireman.
A question that I probably should ask toward the end of our second episode, but it's crossing my mind now. What what patterns did you observe over these individuals we'll talk about over the next few minutes? Any patterns of observation that they used that our listeners could learn from? You mentioned that he just walking around London, he observed. Any other things?
Yeah, well, I mean, they all sort of went through this pattern of, seeing something, recognizing preventable harm, thinking causally, um, trying to come up with a solution, trying to translate that solution, and then persisting through resistance. Resistance is a big part of the book, very big part.
Mhm.
But yeah, observing. So he read widely. I mean, he read these things. He read these books by Daniel Defoe, who observed about what had happened in the Great Fire of London, but
Mhm.
also about this concept of the public good, about building public projects, and that
Mhm.
influenced him tremendously because he built tons of public projects. His name is all over Philadelphia. Uh, so he just absorbed what he read and what he saw, and thought very critically about it, and came up with these ideas.
Mhm.
But one of the major things that Franklin had, which few other people had, which was amazing, was he was a publisher. He had a newspaper, a very famous newspaper. So he had this platform, like he was the influencer of his day.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can't get someone to publish your letter to the editor, become the editor.
Exactly.
Excellent. So our second example, and I'm taking these a bit out of order. I had just written a piece on this a couple of months ago on Dr. Semmelweis. Many will recognize that name. Um, in the 1800s, realized that unwashed hands were a major cause of death in the delivery of babies and their mothers. And so we talk about resistance with that as a setup, 1800s, high risk area with maternity and birth. Tell us about what he went through to discover, seeing the patterns, and the phenomenal resistance he met with.
Oh, he met with a lot of resistance. And most people don't really know that. They think of Semmelweis, hand washing, great guy, and the story ends for them. And they don't realize that he met with the resistance and that his life had turned to a tragedy at the end. But he was a young guy. He started in obstetrics at this big hospital in Vienna. Uh, and he was there for a while and he realized something was going on because they had two clinics. They had one that was sort of covered by midwives and one covered by the students and the physicians. And it turns out that the one covered by the students and the physicians had a high mortality rate. They had childbed fever or puerperal fever. And people couldn't understand why. They attributed to a lot of things in the theories of the day. There's a theory called miasma, which means it's in the air. But it bothered him tremendously about this. He kept on seeing all these women die. And he couldn't figure out why. And it turns out that this hospital had one amazing thing. They kept records. My kind of guy looked at data. Uh, and he was able to look at the data and he saw the difference between these two clinics. It was just amazing. I mean, actually, a lot of people knew the difference about these clinics. Women would get admitted to the hospital and they would beg not to go to the clinic with the doctors. They wanted to go to the one with the midwives. But he saw that and he couldn't figure out what was causing this. And he was very methodical, very analytical. He went through a series of questions. He asked, could it be this? Could it be that? Could it be this? Could it be that? Could it be? And he eliminated all these things. He couldn't figure out what it was. And then he went away on a vacation to Milan, I think. No, Venice. He went to Venice. And while he was there, one of his colleagues, mentor, died. And he came back and couldn't understand what he died from. And then he got his hands on the autopsy and so on. And he realized what had happened. The doctor had pricked his finger, part of his hand, on something which was infected. They didn't know anything about germ theory or infection in those days. But what he developed was quite similar to what the women developed in terms of childbed fever, affecting the different organs and the way they appeared. And it just hit him all of a sudden, like something's going around doing this. And he thought about it and thought about it, and he came up with a solution. He realized, and this sounds terrible nowadays. I mean, it's just absolutely terrible. But the medical students and the physicians would go and examine the women who died in autopsy. And then they'd be subject to all the organs and all the stuff, and then they'd go and then they'd examine the new patients.
Oh my goodness. Oh, oh.
So he didn't come up with a theory about germs. He just called these were cadaverous particles, is what he described them. And he realized that you could smell it on your hands, and he wanted to get rid of that smell. So he came up with this idea of a chlorine solution. and he got permission to try it out. And it was dramatic. Rates went down 80, 90%. But then the whole thing fell apart.
Why?
Well, one thing was that he was a junior person. He was also an outsider. He was a Hungarian in Vienna. And it was going against the theory of the day. I told you about this miasma theory.
Mm-hmm.
But also, he was basically telling everybody else that their hands were dirty, literally. And you physicians, you shouldn't be doing this. And then he didn't have enough people on his side. He had a few people, but they were sort of wishy-washy in their support. Some were more so than others. And also his personality was a little bit of, attacking others who attacked him.
Mm-hmm.
But he also, in those days, he didn't publish. He didn't publish right away. It took him a long time to publish his results. But one thing after another, and he was let go from his position. He had to return to Hungary. He tried to do something. Eventually, he published his treatise on this whole topic. But still, he would attack people who didn't agree with him. So it sort of fell by the wayside. There were people throughout Europe who understood what he had done and tried to implement it, but not on a scale that it should have been. And it took years later before Pasteur came along with his germ theory, and then Joseph Lister came up with the antiseptics and so on. But he was a guy who did something.
Absolutely.
He was the one true failure in the book in terms of prevention. He got through certain steps and then he couldn't go the rest of the way.
So, as we talked about, listeners, this is going to conclude our first episode. But since some of you might not be able to catch episode 2, if people want to get in contact with you, Dr. Davis, how would they do that? When does your book come out, by the way?
May 5th.
May 5th. Okay. How can they, if they have further questions, if they want an opportunity to speak with you or dig into how you approach this whole situation, how can they contact Dr. Barry Davis?
Well, they can look on they can contact me through my academic email.
Okay.
Which is on my website. You just Google my name and you'll get there.
Great. And we'll put it in the show notes also for the listeners.
Right. And then there's the publisher, Johns Hopkins University Press. They can contact me anytime.
Excellent. To our listeners, thank you for being with us today. And to Dr. Barry Davis, thank you for being with us. And we'll see you on episode 2.